I said, hey, it's showtime. And Helen was like, oh, let me put my phone down. Because she was looking at her phone. So I didn't even we just been sitting here chatting, and I don't even have my notes out, my notebook. It smells like donuts. Doesn't that smell like donuts, or am I just crazy? I could be crazy. There is a definite possibility that I could be crazy. And that's okay. So welcome to Chitchattin with Becca. We're here with Dr. Helen. Amy is watching football. So we're just going to be doing the show by ourselves today. And she may come in and sneak in and look, because she does like to be in the shot. You know how excited she is when she gets in the shot. So welcome to the show. We're going to be discussing Eudora Welty, and Dr. Helen is going to be reading her short story, A Worn Path, and then we're just going to be having a chat afterwards. We've got Dr. Delores Zumwalt on the line as well, so we're going to bring her into the chat in just a second. We had another friend who was going to be on here, but I can't find her, so if she shows up, then we'll pop her in. So let me go ahead and let's get Dr. D. Let's bring Dr. D. Okay, Dr. D, here we go. Hi, Dr. D.
Hello.
Hi.
It's nice to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I'm glad you could make it.
Thanks for coming and playing with us today. It's a lot of fun. And you're entered in the raffle that you could win this book.
Yay. That's one I don't have.
Oh, you don't? Oh,
yeah.
Have you had a chance to read it yet?
No, I haven't.
It's a wonderful. She actually wrote it for kids. It's kind of It's in the same sort of targeted age range like the Harry Potter books. So that kind of preteen age. But it's a wonderful story. It's just really little sweet novella about a bird that lives in a shoe store. And it's after one night after the store has closed, the bird lets all his bird friends come in and they try on all the shoes. It's really sweet. It's really sweet.
So just to let our audience know, this is Dr. Delores Zumwalt. Dr. Delores, is it okay if I call you Dr. D or Dr. Z?
Perfect.
So Dr. D and Dr. H, y'all used to work together. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, for a long time.
Yeah, and they are both Welty scholars. So having them on here to discuss Eudora Welty is amazing. And we thank you so much for joining us, Dr. D. And it's so nice to meet you. And I'm Helen's baby sister.
Thank you.
I'm the baby sister.
To meet you too, Becca.
Do what?
It's wonderful to meet you too. I've heard much about you.
Well, I hope it was all good. Don't believe everything you hear.
Don't tell it.
Don't tell. So just to let everybody know, this is kind of a different format that we normally do our show. This is kind of like a little book club show today instead of our normal stuff. So we're not going to do all of that other stuff that we do. We're just going to get right into the reading of the book. So Helen, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Okay. So this is the short story, A Worn Path by Eudora Welty. This story was published in February of 1941. Okay. So we shall begin. A Worn Path. It was December, a bright frozen day in the early morning. Far out in the country, there was an old Negro woman with her head tied in a red rag, coming along a path through the woods. Her name was Phoenix Jackson. She was very old and small, and she walked slowly in the dark pine shadows, moving a little from side to side in her steps with the balanced heaviness and lightness of a pendulum in a grandfather clock. She carried a thin, small cane made from an umbrella, and with this she kept tapping the frozen earth in front of her. This made a grave and persistent noise in the still air that seemed meditative, like the chirping of a solitary little bird. She wore a dark striped dress reaching down to her shoe tops, and an equally long apron of bleached sugar sacks with a full pocket, all neat and tidy. But every time she took a step, she might have fallen over her shoelaces, which dragged from her unlaced shoes. She looked straight ahead. Her eyes were blue with age. Her skin had a pattern all its own of numberless branching wrinkles, and as though a whole little tree stood in the middle of her forehead, but a golden color ran underneath, and the two knobs of her cheeks were illumined by a yellow burning under the dark. Under the red rag, her hair came down on her neck in the frailest of ringlets, still black and with an odor like copper. Now and then there was a quivering in the thicket. Old Phoenix said, "Out of my way, all you foxes, owls, beetles, jackrabbits, coons, and wild animals. Keep out from under these feet, little bob whites. Keep the big wild hogs out of my path. Don't let none of those come running in my direction. I got a long way." Under her small black freckled hand, her cane, limber as a buggy whip, would switch at the brush as if to rout up any hiding things. On she went. The woods were deep and still. The sun made the pine needles almost too bright to look at, up where the wind rocked. The cones dropped as light as feathers. Down in the hollow was the mourning dove. It was not too late for him. The path ran up a hill. "Seem like there's chains about my feet time I get this far," she said, in the voice of argument old people keep to use with themselves. "Something always take a hold of me on this hill, pleads I should stay." After she got to the top, she turned and gave a full, severe look behind her, where she had come. "Up through pines," she said at length, "now down through oaks." Her eyes opened their widest, and she started down gently. But before she got to the bottom of the hill, a bush caught her dress. Her fingers were busy and intent, but her skirts were full and long, so that before she could pull them free in one place, they were caught in another, and it was not possible to allow the dress to tear. "I am the thorny bush," she said. "Thorns you do in your appointed work. Never want to let folks pass, no sir. Old eyes thought you were a pretty little green bush." Finally, trembling all over, she stood free, and after a moment dared to stoop for her cane. "Sun so high," she cried, leaning back and looking while the thick tears went over her eyes. "The time getting all gone here." At the foot of this hill was a place with a log, where a log was laid across the creek. "Now comes the trial," said Phoenix. Putting her right foot out, she mounted the log and shut her eyes. Lifting her skirt, leveling her cane fiercely before her like a festival figure in some parade, she began to march across. Then she opened her eyes and she was safe on the other side. "I wasn't as old as I thought," she said. But she sat down to rest. She spread her skirts on the bank around her and folded her hands over her knees. Up above her was a tree and a pearly cloud of mistletoe. She did not dare to close her eyes, and when a little boy brought her a plate with a slice of marble cake on it, she spoke to him. "That would be acceptable," she said. But when she went to take it, there was just her own hand in the air. So she left that tree and had to go through a barbed wire fence. There she had to creep and crawl, spreading her knees and stretching her fingers like a baby trying to climb the steps. But she talked loudly to herself. She could not let her dress be torn now, so late in the day, and she could not pay for having her arm or leg sawed off if she got caught fast where she was. At last she was safe through the fence and risen up out in the clearing. Big dead trees like black men with one arm were standing in the purple stalks of the withered cotton field. There sat a buzzard. "Who you watching?" In the furrows she made her way along. "Glad this not the season for bulls," she said, looking sideways, "and the good Lord made us snakes to curl up and sleep in the winter. A pleasure I don't see no two-headed snake coming around that tree where it come once. Took a while to get by him back in the summer." She passed through the old cotton and went into a field of dead corn. It whispered and shook, and was taller than her head. Through the maze, she said, for there was no path. Then there was something tall, black and skinny there, moving before her. At first, she took it for a man. It could have been a man dancing in the field. But she stood still and listened, and it did not make a sound. It was as silent as a ghost. Ghost, she said sharply, who be you the ghost of? For I've heard of nary death close by. But there was no answer, only the ragged dancing in the wind. She shut her eyes, reached out her hand, and touched a sleeve. She found a coat, and inside that an emptiness cold as ice. You scarecrow, she said, her face lighted. I ought to be shut up for good, she said with laughter. My senses is gone, I too old. I the oldest people I ever know. Dance, old scarecrow, she said, while I dancin' with you. She kicked her foot over the furrow, and with mouth drawn down, shook her head once or twice in a little strutting way. Some husks blew down and whirled in streamers around her skirts. Then she went on, parting her way from side to side with the cane through the whispering field. At last she came to the end, to a wagon track where the silver grass blew between the red ruts. The quail were walking along like pullets, seeming all dainty and unseen. Walk pretty, she said. This the easy place. This the easy going. She followed the track, swaying through the quiet bare fields, through the little strings of trees, silver in their dead leaves, past cabins, silver from weather, with the doors and windows boarded up, all like old women under a spell sitting there. I walk it in their sleep, she said, nodding her head vigorously. In a ravine she went where a spring was silently flowing through a hollow log. Old Phoenix bent and drank. Sweet gum makes the water sweet, she said, and drank more. Nobody knew who made this well, for it was here when I was born. The track crossed a swampy part where the moss hung as white as lace from every limb. Sleep on, alligators, and blow your bubbles. Then the track went into the road. Deep, deep the road went down between the high green-colored banks. Overhead the live oaks met, and it was as dark as a cave. A black dog with a lolling tongue came up out of the weeds by the ditch. She was meditating and not ready, and when he came at her, she only hit him a little with her cane. Over she went in the ditch, like a little puff of milkweed. Down there her senses drifted away. A dream visited her, and she reached her hand up, but nothing reached down and gave her a pull. So she lay there and presently went to talking. Old woman, she said to herself, that black dog come up out of the weeds to stall you off, and now there he's sitting on his fine tail smiling at you. A white man finally came along and found her, a hunter, a young man with his dog on a chain. Well, Granny, he laughed, what are you doing there? Lying on my back like a June bug waiting to be turned over, mister, she said, reaching out her hand. He lifted her up, gave her a swing in the air, and set her down. Anything broken, Granny? No, sir, them old dead weeds is springy enough, said Phoenix when she got her breath. I thank you for your trouble. Where do you live, Granny? He asked while the two dogs were growling at each other. Away back yonder, sir, behind the ridge. You can't even see it from here. On your way home? No, sir, I go into town. Why, that's too far. That's as far as I walk when I come out myself, and I get something for my trouble. He patted the stuffed bag he carried, and there hung down a little closed claw. It was one of the bobwhites, with its beak hooked bitterly to show it was dead. Now you go on home, Granny. I'm bound to go to town, mister, said Phoenix. The time come around. He gave another laugh, filling the whole landscape. I know you old colored people wouldn't miss going to town to see Santa Claus. But something held old Phoenix very still. The deep lines in her face went into a fierce and different radiation. Without warning, she had seen with her own eyes a flashing nickel fall out of the man's pocket onto the ground. "How old are you, Granny?" he was saying. "There's no tellin', mister," she said, "no tellin'." Then she gave a little cry and clapped her hands and said, "Get on away from here, dog. Look at that dog." She laughed as if in admiration. "He ain't scared of nobody. He a big black dog," she whispered. "Sick him." "Watch me get rid of that cur," said the man. "Sick him, Pete, sick him." Phoenix heard the dogs fighting and heard the man running and throwing sticks. She even heard a gunshot. But she was slowly bending forward by that time, further and further forward. The lids stretched down over her eyes as if she were doing this in her sleep. Her chin was lowered almost to her knees. The yellow palm of her hand came out from the fold of her apron. Her fingers slid down and along the ground under the piece of money with the grace and care they would have in lifting an egg from under a setting hen. Then she slowly straightened up. She stood erect, and the nickel was in her apron pocket. A bird flew by. Her lips moved. "God watching me the whole time I come to stealing." The man came back, and his own dog panted around them. "Well, I scared him off that time," he said, and then he laughed and lifted his gun and pointed it at Phoenix. She stood straight and faced him. "Doesn't the gun scare you?" he said, still pointing it. "No, sir. I seen plenty go off closer by in my day, and for less than what I done," she said, holding utterly still. He smiled and shouldered the gun. "Well, Granny," he said, "you must be 100 years old and scared of nothing. I'd give you a dime if I had any money with me, but you take my advice and stay home, and nothing will happen to you." "I'm bound to go on my way, mister," said Phoenix. She inclined her head in the red rag. Then they went in different directions, but she could hear the gun shooting again and again over the hill. She walked on. The shadows hung from the oak trees to the road like curtains. Then she smelled wood smoke and smelled the river, and she saw a steeple and the cabins on their steep steps. Dozens of little black children whirled around her. There ahead was Natchez shining. Bells were ringing. She walked on. In the paved city it was Christmas time. There were red and green electric lights strung and crisscrossed everywhere, and all turned on in the daytime. Old Phoenix would have been lost if she had not distrusted her eyesight and depended on her feet to know where to take her. She paused quietly on the sidewalk where people were passing by. A lady came along in the crowd, carrying an armful of red, green, and silver-wrapped presents. She gave off perfume like the red roses in hot summer, and Phoenix stopped her. "Please, missy, will you lace up my shoe?" She held up her foot. "What do you want, Grandma?" "See my shoes," said Phoenix. "Do all right for out in the country, but wouldn't look right to go in a big building." "Stand still then, Grandma," said the lady. She put her packages down on the sidewalk beside her and laced and tied both shoes tightly. "Can't lace them with a cane," said Phoenix. "Thank you, missy. I don't mind asking a nice lady to tie up my shoe when I gets out on the street." Moving slowly and from side to side, she went into the big building and into a tower of steps, where she walked up and around until her feet knew to stop. She entered a door, and there she saw nailed up on the wall a document that had been stamped with a gold seal and framed in the gold frame which matched the dream that was hung up in her head. "Here I be," she said. There was a fixed and ceremonial stiffness over her body. "A charity case, I suppose," said an attendant who sat at the desk before her. But Phoenix only looked above her head. There was sweat on her face, and the wrinkles in her skin shone like a bright net. "Speak up, Grandma," the woman said. "What's your name? We must have your history, you know. Have you been here before? What seems to be the trouble with you? Old Phoenix only gave a twitch to her face, as if a fly were bothering her. Are you deaf? Cried the attendant. But then the nurse came in. Oh, that's just old Aunt Phoenix, she said. She doesn't come for herself. She has a little grandson. She makes these trips just as regular as clockwork. She lives away back off the old Natchez Trace. She bent down. Well, Aunt Phoenix, why don't you take a seat? We won't keep you standing after your long trip. She pointed. The old woman sat down, bolt upright in the chair. Now, how is the boy? Asked the nurse. Old Phoenix did not speak. I said, how is the boy? But Phoenix only waited and stared straight ahead, her face very solemn and withdrawn into rigidity. Is his throat any better? Asked the nurse. Aunt Phoenix, don't you hear me? Is your grandson's throat any better since the last time you came for the medicine? With her hands on her knees, the old woman waited, silent, erect, and motionless, just as if she were in armor. You mustn't take up our time this way, Aunt Phoenix, the nurse said. Tell us quickly about your grandson and get it over. He isn't dead, is he? At last there was a flicker, and then a flame of comprehension across her face, and she spoke. My grandson. It was my memory had left me. There I sat and forgot why I made my long trip. Forgot? The nurse. After you came so far? Then Phoenix was like an old woman, begging a dignified forgiveness for waking up frightened in the night. I never did go to school. I was too old at the surrender, she said in a soft voice. I'm an old woman without an education. It was my memory failed me. My little grandson, he is just the same, and I forgot it in the coming. Throat never heals, does it? Said the nurse, speaking in a loud, sure voice to old Phoenix. By now she had a card with something written on it, a little list. Yes, swallowed lie. When was it? January? 2, 3 years ago? Phoenix spoke unasked now. No, missy, he not dead. He just the same. Every little while his throat begin to close up again, and he not able to swallow. He not get his breath. He not able to help himself. So the time come around, and I go on another trip for the soothing medicine. All right, the doctor said, as long as you came to get it, you could have it, said the nurse. But it's an obstinate case. My little grandson, he sit up there in the house all wrapped up, waiting by himself, Phoenix went on. We is the only two left in the world. He suffer and it don't seem to put him back at all. He got a sweet look. He going to last. He wear a little patch quilt and peep out holding his mouth open like a little bird. I remember so plain now. I'm not going to forget him again, no, the whole enduring time. I could tell him from all the others in creation. All right, the nurse said, was trying to hush her now. She brought her a bottle of medicine. Charity, she said, making a check mark in a book. Old Phoenix held the bottle close to her eyes and then carefully put it into her pocket. I thank you, she said. It's Christmas time, Grandma, said the attendant. Can I give you a few pennies out of my purse? 5 pennies is a nickel, said Phoenix stiffly. Here's a nickel, said the attendant. Phoenix rose carefully and held out her hand. She received the nickel and then fished the other nickel out of her pocket and laid it beside the new one. She stared at her palm closely with her head on one side. Then she gave a tap with her cane on the floor. This is what come to me to do, she said. I go into the store and buy my child a little windmill they sells made out of paper. He going to find it hard to believe there's such a thing in the world. I'll march myself back where he waiting, holding it straight up in this hand. She lifted her free hand, gave a little nod, turned around, and walked out of the doctor's office. Then her slow step began on the stairs, going down.
Well, that was just wonderful.
I love that story.
I love that story. the imagery of that story is really intense.
Mm-hmm.
I always wonder where to start when we start to talk about this story, because I get so involved in it that by the end of the story, I want to know if there's any medicine in the bottle or they're just giving her an empty bottle.
Right.
And then there's the question of, is her grandson still alive?
Right. I think that's probably one of the biggest questions that people have after they read the story is, because we do see that she has some memory loss and some maybe some dementia going on there, and also moments where we see her imagine the presence of another that's not there. That's one of the biggest questions. She was actually asked in an interview one time, is Phoenix Jackson's grandson alive or not? They wanted to get a definitive answer, as she's the only one who would know, as she wrote the story, if the grandson is alive or not. And her answer was that for Phoenix Jackson, he is alive, and that is all that matters.
Exactly. And Dr. D, jump in here just whenever you want. We're just chatting.
If I could. Welty wrote an interesting essay titled, "Is Phoenix Jackson's Grandson Dead?" And I always loved her answer, which was a refusal to be definitive one way or the other. And so there have been many interpretations, and it's a beautifully written little story that leaves it open for many interpretations. But she famously said, famously for me, that the path was the thing. The journey was the thing that was important in this story, whether or not the little boy was alive or not. And I always thought that's vintage Welty. I always thought that was wonderful.
Absolutely. It's important enough to her that she's willing to go through the journey that she goes through in order to get this little bottle of medicine.
Right.
All that she encounters, which might not seem like very much. She gets stuck in a bush. She's got to cross a log bridge. Probably the most dangerous was the hunter himself that she encounters. But for these things, in a relative sense, are huge challenges for her. Any one of these things could have stopped her journey completely. And so she is that hero going on a journey to collect that most important thing for her community that she loves most dearly, that is her grandson.
Right. She's the hero that's going on the journey for the Golden Fleece or for any other thing that we have our heroes taking a journey for. She is at that moment, that journey is right. I mean, she's got so many trials that she has to go through to get there, going across the log, and then there's the two-headed snake, and then the dog, and all of the imagery that's in any of the other classic hero ancient mythological tales that we have, for sure.
I've taught this story hundreds of times, and I have Welty is renowned for her use of classical mythology and illusions and imagery and so forth in her work. And I always have used that story as a demonstration of that ancient archetype of the journey of the hero. And she's not a Ulysses. She is a modern hero who is. Welty does a magnificent job in creating a modern hero who is small and aged and vulnerable, and yet very successful in the course of her journey. I like to talk about the various trials. There are 3 stages in the hero's journey, but the trial stage is the most fascinating and the most adventuresome one for readers, and she brilliantly uses many of those motifs. For example, the hero in that archetype must take a journey to the underworld. And if you've read the Odyssey, you know that that happens with Odysseus. If you've ever been to the Natchez Trace, We took a vacation there some years ago, and as you near the southern terminus, as you're close to Natchez, which is where she was, is what they call the lower trace, which seems like a story below road level, street level. You have to climb, and so when she says she climbs down, 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 and the oak trees, circle up over her, and it's dark, even though it's midday. That's her journey to the underworld. And very shortly, who does she encounter? The big black dog.
Yeah.
Just like Cerberus, the hound of hell in ancient stories. And so it's just really a brilliant modern adaptation of that archetype.
I think it also allows a way in for readers to make those those mythological tales very personal and specific as well. They're not just ancient stories that happen to heroes that have magical powers and therefore they're fun to listen to and kind of interesting in their own way. But what is it that connects to life now? Because we don't know personally any, people who have magical powers or mythological heroes or anything like that. But this gives us that road in that lets us realize that there are, heroic journeys that happen on a daily basis, and there are people who are doing things that are just as much what we would think would be beyond, because she's had to walk miles into this town. She's had to, crawl up and down these big hills and do all of this in a way that we would think, there's no one who is probably in their 80s who would be able to do something like this, and then have to turn around and walk all the way back and do it all again to return, just to get this little bottle of medicine. So it connects us to a very real idea of these heroes, and I think that connection ends up being one that's very important for us to encounter in that modern sense. That it isn't lost, that these aren't simply mythological times that might or might not have existed. The ideas themselves are very real, and I think that's an important connection for us to make as readers, in translating those ideas into that into a modern world, into our current world.
For sure.
The older I get, the more I realize how heroic her journey was. She has to bend slowly, slowly, slowly to get the nickel. I'm beginning to experience that. I understand. She's this little weak, physically weak lady. She has great spiritual strength, I would say, and determination. It's just a wonderful story. Students, I imagine you've discovered, Helen, that students respond very favorably to this story.
Absolutely, they do. And I think that they're surprised that there's not much, that they've not heard of her before the way that they might have heard of other writers, like a Faulkner or a Hemingway or someone along those lines. They're like, how come we've never encountered her before? And I don't know. She's wonderful,
Well, I think that it's brave if you think about Eudora Welty and the time when she was writing and publishing, it wasn't common for, a lot of women at that time, and even now, use a pseudonym. Did I say that right? Okay. Right. Instead of using their own name. And I'm sure for her at the time, being a working woman in that era was unusual. She was a photographer. She worked at the newspaper. She did all of those other things. And for her to just be publishing, I have these stories and I'm publishing, and look at what a wonderful writer she is, that she wasn't really seen, I think. I mean, because I honestly had never heard about Eudora Welty until you started doing your dissertation. That's when I was like, I wonder who that is. And because it wasn't something that was taught in literature when I was in high school at all. And I find that to be unfortunate, because of her work is so good. I mean, it's just so, and the imagery that it puts in your head, and it's like when she is writing and you're reading her stories, it's like a picture book that you're seeing happening in your mind. Like you can see every single thing that she's laying out. And I think her being a photographer helps with that imagery. But I do believe that it just is probably, part that she was just, instead of saying it's E. Welty or something like that, she just said, hey, I'm a lady and I'm writing, and here it is.
Right.
And I'm good. So check it out,
Well, and she was a very quiet, retiring person who didn't like to bring attention to herself. And yet, it is a dichotomy. She was very determined in her efforts to get published. This afternoon I reread her introduction to the Collected Stories, which was published in 1980. And
that's what I was reading from.
she noted in that, she kind of gave a point-by-point explanation of how she came to be published, and she acknowledges she was quite lucky that fortunately a couple of prominent people in the publishing world read her work and recognized the value of it. Otherwise, she may have been, well, she often was tagged as simply a regionalist writer.
Exactly. And I think that's unfortunate that she was kind of pigeonholed into being just a Southern writer, because her stories are so human, and they're so real. And I think also part of it might be because she shines so brightly as a short story writer, that people might have, even though she did write novels as well. I think that, I wonder if people might have kind of dismissed it just for the shorter nature of the work. But William Faulkner praised her. He said it takes a special person, basically. I'm not quoting directly, but he said it takes a special person to be able to write a good short story, because you only have such limited space.
Absolutely.
And he said she is one of the brightest in that talent. And I don't know, Delores, have you toured her home?
Yes. Oh, I did. Oh, the year that we did the Natchez Trace.
Ah, gotcha.
We traveled the full length of the trace from just south of Nashville all the way to its southern terminus, and we stopped off in Jackson so that I could tour her house, and it meant the world to me. It really did.
Absolutely, it's so wonderful, and one of the things that you learn when you tour her home, which is open, kind of preserved as a museum now, a tourist attraction, is that when you go into her home, she didn't, even though she won a Pulitzer, she won, all sorts of awards for her writing. When she donated her home and they went in to look at all of her things and, figure out how they were going to preserve the home and make it kind of a national or, a state treasure, all of those awards were still in their original boxes in a closet.
I love that story.
And the one praise that she framed and put on the wall is a letter from William Faulkner that she got early in her publishing career. Early in her career, he sent her a letter almost like a fan letter, but of course he was already, a mighty writer at that time, just basically saying, good work, keep it up, and that's what she has framed on the wall.
The Pulitzer was stuffed in a closet, but
Exactly. But the letter from Faulkner, that goes up on the wall.
Well, of course, they were fellow Mississippians, and she had a great regard for his work. And Faulkner was a curmudgeon. He hated being compared to Hemingway. They weren't friends. They didn't want to be friends. Many writers wrote to him, and I've read that the only one he ever responded to was Eudora Welty. They enjoyed this mutual admiration for each other's work. They were both dead serious about their work. They were fellow Mississippians. Mm-hmm. And I love this quote. At one time, Welty said, "I live next to a mountain, and its name is Faulkner."
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And so she, like I said, I love her because her ego did not have to be stroked. She was very self-assuming. She was a hardworking writer and a decent human being. Mm-hmm. And, I love her life story. Have you read Suzanne Marr's biography of her, Helen?
I've read, yes, which is wonderful. And I was in preparing for this episode, I went back and was listening to her Harvard lectures. Did you ever get a chance to listen to those?
I haven't listened to them. I'd love to. I've read them in her the closest thing she came to biography was One Writer's Beginnings. Mm-hmm. And those are transcripts or excerpts from her Harvard lectures, which are wonderful.
Yes, they are wonderful. When the day that I defended my dissertation, and I know Dr. Bridges did this with most of us. When the day that I defended my dissertation, I went in about an hour before my defense was to begin and sat down with Dr. Bridges in her office, and we were just kind of going over the game plan. And I was, I'd already spent an hour in the parking lot crying. Yeah, I was so stressed out.
Right.
I was just circling the parking lot, just bawling my eyes out, and then pulled it together so I could sit down with Dr. Bridges in her office. And she gave me these CDs of those lectures. Oh. And she said, I know you probably haven't heard these lectures before, but you need to listen to these. And so the past about week, as I've been driving back and forth from work, I've been listening to those lectures, and they're wonderful. She kind of talks about her process as a writer, which then, goes into, as you said, the book that she published, One Writer's Beginnings. And she reads excerpts from some of her stories and novels. She reads some excerpts from letters that her grandmother had sent to her mother after her parents had gotten married, and her parents then moved away from, her mom was from West Virginia, her dad was from Ohio, and then they moved to Mississippi. And so her mother would send her letters, and she read an excerpt from one of those letters as well. The lectures are wonderful, so you'll have to borrow them.
Well, and read them. Texas, Helen, you'll have to let me listen to a bit of them.
Absolutely. They're wonderful. They're just her. I mean, you could hear she's before just I think several classes. It's not a huge audience of people, but it would have been like several classes that were all together listening, and those students you can hear in their reactions to her just rapt. Mm-hmm. She'll be reading along, and suddenly they'll kind of giggle at something that happens in one of the stories that she was reading. She does a reading, an extended reading from Why I Live at the PO, and the students, which is just so humorous. That is a hilarious story.
Yeah, it is.
And so she reads a bit of that, and then just as she's talking, she's just, you can tell just hearing her speak that that there is such a depth to her thought and her process, but also, as we've mentioned, just very self-deprecating, just not an amount of ego in there.
Right.
Very humble. She's very humble.
Absolutely.
And I've been listening to a lot of her, like if you go on YouTube and just type in Eudora Welty, there's just bloop, and you can listen to
Lots of different little
you
interviews
can
and
listen to her
things.
interviews, you can listen to her read her stories, and I love listening to her. I love listening to the writer's voice reading their own story. I feel like it brings so much to the story when the writer themselves reads their own work, and her inflection and her accent and just the way her, and this is going to sound weird, but the way the shape of her mouth pronounces her words, it makes sense when she's reading the story. And then when you go back and after you've listened to her accent and her inflection and all of that, and then you go back and read the story yourself, you then hear her voice, and it's pretty cool. Like I think it's really cool.
Exactly.
Like
It's that wonderful,
it really
very
puts
kind
me,
of
it puts me in that
rural
place.
Southern accent, just almost an accent that we don't hear anymore.
It's an accent you don't hear anymore, for sure.
It reminds me very much, because of course he was from Mississippi also. It reminds me of interviews when you listen to the historian Shelby Foote.
Okay.
So hers is like the feminine sound of that same accent. Of course, like I said, they're both from Mississippi, but it's that very kind of old-fashioned Southern genteel.
Southern genteel.
Voice.
That's what I'm looking for. Yep. It's very It's very
just
much
very
an
wonderful.
old-fashioned Southern genteel voice that's coming out of her. And then once you hear her speak, for me, once I heard her speak, and then I went back and looked at her work, I was like, oh, well, a lot of the way it's written makes sense to me. Dr. D, I don't know if I have a learning disability, so it's very difficult for me to read. When I hear her reading a story and then I go back and read the story, everything on the page makes sense to me at that point.
Well, I think that's wonderful. I think that's the way most of us today feel about Shakespeare. If we hear Kenneth Branagh Shakespeare, suddenly it makes perfect sense to us. There's something about the story being orally delivered, I think, that's really important.
Absolutely.
Well, and I wonder a lot with Eudora Welty and the way she wrote. I mean, we were still in a lot of telling stories instead of reading stories, because there was still at that time a lot of illiteracy in the world, and especially in the southern parts of the United States. So I wonder if her stories unintentionally weren't written to be read orally to people.
Well, I would argue that some of them are. The Why I Live at the PO, I think, is an excellent example for sure, and I think A Worn Path. And of course, again, when we teach this, we have to let students know 1941 seems like ancient history to them, and probably this story was set in the Depression, which was maybe some 10 years earlier. So that's why a nickel was worth scrambling to get, because of the time period. And stories, especially in the South, the oral tradition, I would say even today is alive and well and being used, but certainly that many years ago, for sure, very important. And she's brilliant in infusing that orality into her work, for sure.
I love how, for me, it's very important to the more you read of hers, of course, the A Worn Path is not written from a first-person narrative, but she uses first-person narrative so much, allowing the main character to tell their own story. Really helps to connect to that idea, that storytelling idea. And she just almost takes herself out of the equation, you know. But at the same time, that very logically connects to her photography, you know, to where she's looking through the viewfinder and just letting you see what she sees. But she's letting you hear the stories. She's letting you hear the voices. She's letting you hear the language, and you know, but then also see that location in that world as well, and that time. You know, one of the things that she said in the Harvard lectures that I thought was so interesting is that a lot of times the stories that she would write would be stories that she was thinking about for a long time, and not necessarily the story itself, but the idea behind what the story is about. She would have been thinking about for a long time. And then something would happen. She would see something or hear something, or there would just be something that would then spark the story to happen. And as she explained that idea, she actually refers to a worn path. She had been thinking for a long time about the idea of sacrifice and love and different things like that. And she said that she was one day sitting with a friend who was, I think, a painter or something, but they were just sitting outside on a porch. She was reading, her friend was painting or doing whatever they were doing. And suddenly she looked way off in the distance, and she saw a solitary woman walking across a field. And that sparked the beginning of this story. Why would person, you know, they're out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but all of these fields and forested areas and woods and things. Where did they come from? Where were they going? Why were they going? And it all kind of became, you know, tied into what she had already been kind of contemplating in the idea of sacrifice and love and all of this. And just out of that one moment of seeing this solitary woman walking across a large field, it pulled all of these ideas in and became then this story.
I love that. I've seen an interview where she talked about that, and I do love that idea. And there's where I think, Becca, like you say, the idea of the photographer's work, she sees that image and suddenly it crystallizes into something she wants to write. And, you know, that idea of love, you know, she often said that love was at the center of the theme of many of her works, all different types of love. And certainly we see that beautifully developed in this story. And once again, like Welty said, it doesn't matter whether the grandson is dead or alive. The love, you know, continues for him.
Absolutely. And the how much she's willing to sacrifice to go through the journey that she goes through in order to provide what he needs, even providing for that small happiness of bringing back the pinwheel.
Oh, yes, I love that.
You know, that this money she acquires along the way, she's not even going to use for herself. She's going to use it for him. So he is kind of the center of her world. And all she does is for him.
Well, and you just, I don't know about y'all or anybody else who's read the story, but I immediately fall in love with her character. And I feel like while she is going on this journey,
And a lot of stories, you feel like you're going on the journey as well. Or maybe you're put in the position of the character and you become the character who's making the journey. And this, I feel like we hover around her and we're just kind of a force that hovers behind her, helping to urge her on her journey. And we want her to get there as much as she wants to get there. And by the end of that story, I think I've read the story. I read it over and over and I think about it a lot. I run in the mornings, and in the mornings when I'm running, I think about this story a lot. And I see this image of her in my mind. And I have so much feeling for Phoenix Jackson. Like I feel so much for her that I really appreciate the way Miss Welty makes you just fall in love with the character. And even if you think about Why I Live at the PO, like
I love that story.
I love her that she is. I'm going to go live at the PO, and I'm going to take this here pen, and I'm going to take my phone, I'm going to take my water bottle, and I'm going to go live in the post office. You can't stop me. I mean, I'm just like, you know what, girl? You go live at that post office. You go.
And then think about the skill of an author to compel us to love and support such a flawed person, you know. Somebody asked her once, or somebody once said something to her to the effect, you seem to love all your characters. Well, some of them are quite flawed, and we must be unlovable people. But I can't remember. Do you remember her answer to that, Helen? I think it was something like she tries to get inside of them and write from their perspective. And she does it so well that we either empathize or we come to like them. And surely little Phoenix Jackson is one for me. The idea of a tiny, frail character who doesn't have a whole lot of physical strength, although I've seen the trace. I've seen it in the 21st century. I can't imagine it in the 1930s. It's pretty rough terrain. But she's able to withstand that because she has all this inner strength, and it's fueled by love, which Welty believes is, central to strength in humanity.
Yep.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that and we could talk about the times that we're in right now, where things are so much not fueled by love right now, and that we really need to try to, get back to that, that let's fill spaces with love, and let's fill spaces with and I think that even at that time, I mean, if you think about what was going on when Miss Welty was writing these particular stories, they're going through the same stuff that we're going through now. I mean, it's a cycle that we just continue, everybody just continues to do the same thing. And I think as a species, that's kind of what we do. We just do the same stuff. But,
repeat history, unfortunately. And
but at least she's also kind of putting us out there and saying, let's come at each other in a space of love, which I think is really fantastic.
Right, but seeing others as full human beings as well, in understanding, even when she's writing about characters that are greatly flawed, she still makes that effort to just, they're not just the bad guy or the villain of the story, even though that might be their function within the story, they are still human. And she wants us to see each and every character as fully human.
Well, even Papa Daddy and his big old beard, you don't want him to cut that off.
But that's his beard. Why in the world would you want him to cut? That's his beard. I imagine that it was probably this giant, unruly nest of a beard, that was this long down to his belt. And you're like, well, but that's his.
I know. He needs to be wearing that.
Well, when you talk about that, her handling of King McLean in The Golden Apples, who's this, womanizing, he shirks his responsibilities, and yet we do still see his humanity. We may not like it still.
Exactly.
But we do recognize she's brilliant at it. I've always been sorry she was not awarded the Nobel Prize. I believe she deserved it for her work.
Absolutely should have. She definitely, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Do you know, and I don't know, this is one of my favorite things about just little tidbits about her. Did you know that she had her own cut and paste system? I don't
Oh,
know if you,
yes, I did with
she used to, when she was working on a story, she would type up the story, but as she is, and of course, because she's doing it on just an old manual typewriter, and not like a computer where you can move things around, she would actually, type up the story. She would actually cut sentences and paragraphs apart, and she would, on a cloth, pin and repin them in different orders.
right.
She was developing stories.
That's a newspaper thing.
So
That's a journalist thing.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
learned how to do that in journalism. That was something
Wow.
when I took journalism in high school.
Wow.
And it was
They're
still,
gonna do
everything
an
was on a
old-
typewriter. When I was in high school, we used typewriters. We didn't have computers.
Oh, you're
Well,
too young for that, Becca.
I know. I'm a 72 model, so we had a computer in the school, and I think it was in the principal's office.
Oh my
Because
God.
I remember seeing it once when I was in the principal's office, but don't tell. Because I did spend a lot of time in the principal's office. But we did, when I was in journalism, we did cut out different things. And we would take them to big pieces of poster board until the story made sense. And our teacher would come by and she would say, untape that, tape it over here, and move things around. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Used with her stories.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure Dr. Janet would be like, we didn't do that. We did when I was in high school.
Absolutely.
For sure. Well, this has been a fantastic chat. I've just loved every second of it. And I really hope that that we are able to impart some love of this author to our audience. And if y'all want to do a further chat along the way, can you believe we're getting to the end of the year? I would say here in a little bit, but I mean, it's next year at this point. Then we can kind of all circle back around together and have an even bigger chat if we wanted to, talking about what an amazing person she is and what a great writer she is. But our Dr. D, our show is an hour long, so
we've hit the mark.
We've hit it.
Well, I thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I'm so glad that you were here, and thank you for joining us. And you get your name in the raffle.
Yay!
We'll get Helen to sign these books too. So Dr. Helen will sign them, and then when maybe your name will get pulled out of the hat. Maybe we'll look for it. We'll be like, "Where's Dr. D's name?"
You don't have to do that.
So we appreciate you so much, and thank you so much for joining us. And we'd love to have you on again if you're ever interested.
I would love it. Thank you so much. You
Thank
take care here in Texas, okay?
Yeah, for sure.
Their list. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and if next time you come to Dallas, you let us know because we'd love to have lunch with you.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, I long for the day we can have lunch together. That
for sure.
I long to travel to Texas. I'd have been back by now if it's possible. So we will do that. It's a date. Okay.
Yay! All right. Thank you, Dr. D. Bye. Well, that was awesome. It's so wonderful that she was able to join us, and I hope that our conversation does spark some interest in Eudora Welty's book. You can pick up any of her books at your local library. So go and check her out. She's an amazing writer.
She's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. And we love her a lot. And don't forget that to enter our raffle to win a copy of The Shoebird, all you have to do is like and comment on our post. We'll put all of the names in a hat, and we'll pull them out in a couple of weeks. Excuse me. In a couple of weeks, you can go onto our YouTube channel. You can like and comment there. Obviously, you can like and comment on excuse me, my goodness gracious, on this post as well. I was drinking water and it all of a sudden is backing up. Our next show, we're going to take a couple of weeks off, and our next show, we're actually going to be on location at Fair Park, which is where the Texas State Fair Park is held here in the DFW in Dallas, just not far from here. So we're going to go to Fair Park, and we're going to look at some of the old buildings. The fairgrounds, if you've never been to the Texas State Fair, are amazing. The fairgrounds were built in 1887. There's a lot of 1920s architecture, a lot of huge statues, and it's just an absolutely beautiful place to be. You can join us if you want to. And we'll just walk around. And so y'all join us for that. Like I said, we're gonna take a couple of weeks off because we're fixing to get into the holidays here. So that show will be on December 5th. So join us then. And until then, happy chit-chatting, y'all.
Happy Thanksgiving as well.
Yeah, for sure. Happy all holidays. Happy
All
holidays.
all the happies.
Bye.